What would you do if a total stranger on a plane handed you a lifeline, and years later showed up not to save you but to walk beside the woman you became? The plane hummed softly in the quiet night sky. Most passengers had slipped into that strange half-sleep unique to late-night flights heads, resting against windows, necks bowed to gravity, the dim cabin light casting long, gentle shadows. But Ava Carter was wide awake. She sat stiffly in seat 28A, her hoodie pulled low over her forehead, arms wrapped tightly around the small bundle pressed against her chest, her 5-week-old daughter Sophie, finally, mercifully asleep. Ava hadn't slept in days. Not really. Not since the shelter. Not since she'd run out of options. At 26, she no longer looked like the ballet prodigy she once was. Gone were the grace and poise that had once earned her standing ovations. Tonight, she looked like what she was now, exhausted, broke, and barely holding it together. She stared out the window into the dark, unsure what waited on the other side of the clouds. She could feel the anxiety creeping into her throat again, the kind that sat just behind your ribs and refused to move. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked her phone. She dialed a number she'd memorized long ago, but had promised herself she wouldn't call again. Not after the last time. Not after the voicemail at the shelter that ended with, "Please don't reach out anymore." But tonight, she had no choice. She kept her voice low, barely above a whisper, but desperation has a way of cutting through silence like glass through water. "Nora, please don't hang up," Ava said, her voice cracking. "I know it's late. I know I said I wouldn't call again, but I don't have anywhere else tonight. Just one night. I'll be gone in the morning, I swear." There was a pause on the line. Then a tired sigh. And finally, a reluctant, "Okay, just for tonight." Ava exhaled shakily, mouthing a silent thank you into the dark. "I can take the train from the airport," she added, her voice barely holding steady. "Just, please don't lock the gate." Behind her, in the next row, a man lifted his eyes from the business report on his tablet. Graham Whitmore, 43, had no intention of eavesdropping. But there was something about her voice, the frayed edges of it, the way it balanced between heartbreak and the instinct to protect that pierced through the cocoon of his noise-cancelling headphones. He glanced down at the seatback tray and quietly powered off his device. He didn't say a word. And Ava didn't turn around. But something shifted in that moment between two strangers, one life quietly unraveling, the other pausing to notice. Neither of them knew it yet, but this flight wasn't just to Seattle. It was the beginning of something neither could have predicted. Seattle's midnight rain came down in soft, insistent rhythms, like a percussion that didn't care who was listening. Ava stood outside the arrivals terminal, one hand gripping the stroller, the other tucking her phone into the front pocket of her hoodie. Her socks were damp, her body ached, her mind felt like it had been stretched too thin for too long. Sophie stirred in her bundle, then relaxed again, her tiny fists curled under her chin. The warmth of her daughter's body was the only thing keeping Ava grounded. She looked toward the taxi line. She hadn't ordered one. She couldn't afford to. Then a man in a navy windbreaker stepped forward. "Ma'am," he asked gently, "cab's already paid. Just need your name to confirm." Ava blinked. There's been a mistake," she stammered. "I didn't." He smiled, still neutral but kind. "Rooms reserved under A. Carter, downtown. Hotel Vendome. Paid in full." She stood frozen. Words caught somewhere between suspicion and disbelief. This was too specific to be random, too precise, but too timely to refuse. 10 minutes later, she was inside a warm, softly lit hotel room that smelled faintly of cedarwood and clean sheets. Her shoes were soaked. Her baby was safe. A real crib waited in the corner. There was a note on the desk typed, not handwritten. Short, direct, no strings. "Just rest tonight." Ava didn't cry, not yet. Her body was still locked in survival mode. She moved like a soldier returning from battle, carefully, quietly, as if sudden movement might make it all vanish. She changed Sophie, laid her gently into the crib, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling like it might offer answers. "Who are you?" she whispered to no one. In that silence, Ava let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. The morning light slipped through the hotel curtains like a whispered promise. Soft, cautious, almost afraid to wake the woman on the bed. But Ava Carter was already awake, not from the cry of her 5-week-old daughter, not from a bad dream, but from something strange apiece. For the first time in months, she'd slept longer than 30 minutes. And for the first time in years, she woke in a room that didn't reek of mildew, disinfectant, or fear. She turned her head and saw Sophie still asleep in the crib, one tiny fist stretched toward the light. The room smelled of cedarwood and fresh linen. The bed didn't sag. There was no one knocking, no one yelling, just silence and safety. Ava sat up slowly. She still wasn't sure this was real. Then she saw it again, the note on the desk. Printed, deliberate, no strings. "Just rest tonight. G." Her heart beat faster as she read it again. G. It had to be him. The man behind her on the plane. The one who didn't speak, didn't intrude, but listened. And somehow acted. She couldn't remember the last time someone had done something for her without asking for something in return. And maybe that was what scared her most. Because if there were truly no strings, then what now? Ava gently picked up Sophie and stepped into the bathroom. The warm water from the faucet stung her cracked hands, but she welcomed it. She cleaned up the best she could, dressed Sophie in the last clean onesie, and packed the diaper bag with quiet efficiency. She hadn't paid for this room. She hadn't even booked it. And the longer she stayed, the more she felt like she might break whatever spell had been cast over this unexpected oasis. Then her phone buzzed. She nearly dropped it from the jolt. Not many people had her number anymore. She picked it up and stared at the screen. New email. Subject: Community Arts Re-Entry Program. She opened it cautiously, half expecting spam or a scam, but what she saw made her freeze. Dear Ms. Carter, you've been nominated for accelerated admission into the residential cohort of the Florence Initiative, a re-entry program for performing artists rebuilding after hardship, all expenses covered. Childcare on site, housing included. Orientation begins Monday at 9 o'clock a.m. Sincerely, the Florence Initiative. Ava stared at the screen like it might vanish if she blinked. She hadn't applied to anything. She hadn't told anyone she was even still dancing or trying to. No one at the shelter knew she'd once performed at Lincoln Center, that she had been one of the youngest scholarship students at the East Coast Conservatory. They only saw a tired girl with a crying baby and a duffel bag. So who would nominate her? She scrolled down, hoping to find a contact name, a phone number, anything that would explain. There was none. Just an address. And a time. That Sunday evening, Ava stood outside an ivy-covered brick building in Capitol Hill. The Florence Initiative. It looked more like an old school than a dance center. Weathered, warm, and alive. She held Sophie close and inhaled slowly. Part of her expected a buzzer to reject her, a voice on the intercom to say they'd made a mistake. Instead, the front door opened and a young woman with a clipboard smiled. "Miss Carter?" she asked. Ava nodded, uncertain. And this must be Sophie. She didn't ask about Ava's resume, didn't mention the baby, just turned and waved them in. Inside was a different world. Sunlight spilled onto polished wooden floors, a nursery down the hall. Studios on the ground level, simple meals included, a quiet dorm room of her own. And somehow, still, no questions. No one looked at her like she was broken, or fragile, or temporary. They welcomed her like a person, like a dancer, like someone who had come home. And yet Ava couldn't shake the feeling that someone had orchestrated all this carefully, quietly, and with purpose. She was grateful, but she was also wary, because this kind of good, it usually came with a cost. The next morning, barefoot on Studio B's smooth floors, Ava moved with hesitation. Her body still remembered how to stand, how to breathe, how to bend, but her soul didn't trust it yet. The music was soft. Simple piano chords echoing across the sunlight. She raised one arm, then another. And for a moment, just a moment, she wasn't a statistic. She wasn't tired or scared or a mother holding it all together. She was just Ava. A dancer. A woman. A heartbeat. She didn't notice him at first, not until she turned toward the mirror. There he was, Graham Whitmore, leaning quietly in the doorway, wearing the same charcoal sweater. No suit, no entourage. Just presence. Ava's breath caught. "What are you doing here?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "I came to watch," he said calmly. "You look like someone who hasn't danced for herself in a long time." "You set this up," she said, voice low. "The hotel." "The email, this place." He didn't deny it. "I only opened a door," he said. "You walked through it." "Why me?" Graham met her gaze, steady, honest. "Because I saw someone worth betting on, and because, once, someone opened a door for Eleanor too." Ava didn't respond. Not with words, but in her chest, something stirred. A mix of gratitude and fear, and the aching, dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to begin again. The next few days passed like a soft dream. Ava didn't dare speak aloud. Each morning she walked Sophie down the sunlit hall to the nursery. The staff greeted her by name. Her daughter was held, cared for, smiled at. Not pitied, not treated like a burden. Then she'd walk to Studio B, barefoot, hair tied back, and begin to move. At first her body resisted tight, uncertain, shaky at the joints. Years of fatigue and fear had settled into her spine like rust. But then something remarkable began to happen. Her muscles remembered. Her balance returned, breath by breath. There were no mirrors for vanity, no instructors shouting counts. Just rhythm, and sunlight, and space. Ava danced. Not for a stage, not for applause. Just for herself. And for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. But peace, Ava knew, was always temporary. It was Thursday afternoon when the storm arrived, not in the sky, but in the world beyond the studio walls. She had just finished stretching when her phone buzzed. A headline blinked onto the screen. Widowed billionaire sponsors young mother through wife's dance foundation. More than charity. Below it, 2 photos. One of her entering the studio, Sophie tucked against her chest. The other, Graham Whitmore, outside the Florence Initiative's building, face calm but unmistakably watchful. The article wasn't cruel, but it was calculated. It used phrases like questions raised and speculation swirling. It hinted, it didn't accuse, but that was enough. Thousands of shares, dozens of comments, some congratulatory, many not. By the time Ava walked into the common area for dinner, the atmosphere had shifted. Smiles thinned. Conversation stopped when she passed. Chairs were pushed closer together away from hers. At lunch the next day, no one sat at her table. Even the nursery workers greeted her with a new kind of caution, professional but distant, like she might be contagious. She understood it. People here had fought hard to reclaim their dignity, to be seen as more than sob stories, and now it seemed she had become the story. The one with a secret connection, the one who didn't earn her place, but had it arranged. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Ava stepped onto the rooftop garden. Rain misted across the stones. She wrapped her coat tighter and let her breath steam into the air. She wasn't surprised to find Graham already there. He hadn't called. He never did. "You saw it," she said flatly. He nodded. Eyes on the skyline. "It'll fade," he said softly. "These things always do." "It's not the story," she replied. "It's what it's doing to the people around me, the people I was finally starting to trust." Graham turned to her. There was genuine pain in his eyes. "You shouldn't have to pay a price for someone else's grief," he said. "But I am," Ava snapped, "because you didn't tell me what I was walking into." He looked down. And for once, Graham Whitmore had nothing to say. Over the next week, Ava stopped showing up early. She stopped lingering after class. She stopped making eye contact with anyone who might have once smiled at her. Isolation had once been a shield. Now, it felt like punishment. But worse than the silence of others was the voice inside her. Was I chosen because I deserved it, or because I reminded him of her? On Thursday morning, a new instructor entered Studio B. Margaret Green, mid-50s, hair in a tight silver bun, eyes sharp as glass, a legend from another era. Ava remembered watching her on grainy YouTube clips as a teenager, marveling at the way she moved like time bent to her rhythm. Margaret didn't acknowledge the press, didn't flinch when Ava entered the room. She clapped once. "We begin again." And for the next hour, she broke Ava open and rebuilt her movement by movement, breath by breath. No compliments, no coddling. Only truth. After class, as Ava packed up her bag, Margaret lingered at the door. "You dance like someone who's never been given anything twice," she said, voice low. Then she added, "Don't let anyone confuse being given a chance with being given a life." And then she walked away. That night, Ava couldn't sleep. She sat at the small desk in her dorm room and opened her notebook. Sophie lay quietly in the crib beside her, tiny chest rising and falling like a metronome. Ava picked up a pen, and she wrote, "Graham, thank you for opening the door. But I need to know that I'm walking through it because I chose to, not because I remind someone of someone else, not because it makes a good story, not because I'm someone's project. I need to build something that feels like mine, even if that means starting over again. Please don't contact me. I won't be part of a memorial. I'm still alive. Ava." When she dropped the envelope off at the front desk the next morning, it was raining again. Seattle's way of applauding, she thought, quietly, softly, without fanfare. She packed her things, loaded Sophie into the stroller, and walked away. No press. No confrontation, no one chasing after her. Just one woman, one child, and the slow rhythm of footsteps finding their way forward. The cheapest apartment Ava could find sat above a laundromat in Rainier Valley. The windows rattled whenever the dryers downstairs spun too fast. The heater only worked if you kicked it twice. And the ceiling leaked in a corner no towel could fully protect. But it was hers. There was no foundation name on the lease. No application, no scholarship, no letter of recommendation, just her own signature. Ava Carter. That name had once been printed on posters. Now it was scribbled on a rental agreement, wrinkled and water-stained. And yet, she'd never felt more in control. Morning started early. She'd bundle Sophie in a second-hand stroller, zip her coat tight, and walk 4 blocks to a small community center on a rec room, now painted with bright murals and filled with folding chairs and dreams. Ava taught beginner ballet classes twice a week. Kids between 5 and 9, some shy, some bold, some with tap shoes, others barefoot. She didn't ask where they came from. She just taught them to move, to stand tall, to breathe. The pay barely covered diapers and oatmeal. But at night, when Sophie fell asleep, Ava would clear a small square of floor in the living room and dance, Not for anyone, not for approval, but because the movement kept her from disappearing. One Wednesday afternoon, as class ended, Ava knelt beside a quiet 7-year-old girl named Aria. Aria had trouble lifting her heels, but today she'd held first position for 3 full counts. Ava smiled and gently adjusted her posture. "You're stronger than you think," she said. Aria's eyes lit up, just for a second. It reminded Ava of herself at that age, when someone else had once said the same thing. Before life broke the rhythm. As the children shuffled out, Ava noticed a woman standing at the back of the room. Expensive coat, arms folded. Sharp eyes, not a parent, not a dancer. Just watching. Ava tensed. The woman approached her slowly, heels silent on the worn floor. "You're Ava Carter," she said. Ava didn't flinch. "That depends," she replied carefully. "Are you here to compliment or confront me?" The woman didn't smile. "I'm Danielle Brooks," she said, "founder of the Community Dance Collective." A beat. "Margaret Green sent me." Ava's stomach tightened. Margaret, the last person who had truly seen her move. The last one who had spoken truth without flattery or pity. Danielle handed her a business card. Community Dance Collective Board Launch Candidate Founder, Danielle Brooks. "We're building a non-profit. Real work, real equity. You don't owe anyone to join. You just have to be good." Ava looked down at the card. It felt heavier than it should have. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just nodded once and slipped the card into her bag. She no longer made quick decisions. That night, after Sophie had fallen asleep in her crib beside the heater that still groaned in protest, Ava sat on the floor with her back against the wall. She took out the business card, turned it over. Read it again. She thought about Margaret's words and Graham's silence. She thought about the look in Aria's eyes when she finally got it right. About how it had nothing to do with legacy and everything to do with being seen. As she tucked Sophie in tighter, the baby stirred just a little and reached out. Her tiny fingers found a loose strand of Ava's hair and held on. Ava didn't move. She let Sophie clutch it like a lifeline. Then she whispered, more to herself than to her child, "One day, you'll know I didn't walk away because I was afraid. I walked away so that if I ever said yes again, it would be because I chose it." Across the city, in a quiet restaurant booth far from the noise, Graham Whitmore sat alone. No press, no assistant, no glass of wine. Just him. He didn't check his phone, didn't scan the room. He just sat like a man learning how to be still. Then his assistant appeared. She handed him a sealed envelope, marked with the logo of the Whitmore Foundation Grant Committee. He opened it slowly. Inside was a grant proposal. Clear. Crisp. Unmistakably Ava's. At the top, in bold, Dance as Recovery, a model for community-based artistic healing. Submitted by Ava Carter. Residency proposal. Not affiliated with any tribute, legacy, or memorial. Just purpose. Graham exhaled. Not from relief. From something deeper. Respect. He folded the paper gently, set it down, and stared out the window for a long time. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was writing her own rhythm now. The conference center wasn't grand. There were no chandeliers, no marble floors, just wide windows, grey carpet, and the soft hum of vending machines down the hall. But to Ava Carter, it felt like standing on the edge of something massive. She stood behind a simple podium marked Dancer's Recovery, hands resting lightly on the sides, breath steady. It was the first time she'd ever pitched anything publicly. No manager, no gallery, no agent smoothing the way, just her. And her story. She didn't bring a slideshow, she didn't recite statistics. Instead, she told the truth. I was 19 when I thought survival meant shrinking myself to fit whatever saved me. The room went still. I thought if someone gave you a second chance, the only way to honor it was to make yourself smaller, easier to carry. Her voice didn't waver. Not anymore. But I was wrong, because survival doesn't always look like hiding. Sometimes it looks like walking back into a room that once mistook you for a favor and proving you were always a force. No one clapped. Not yet. They just listened. She spoke about how movement had saved her not by erasing pain, but by giving it shape. How every ply, every breath, every pivot had become a way to hold what words couldn't carry. She spoke about Sophie, about walking away from a system that wanted her to be someone else's reflection, and building something that could stand on its own without needing legacy to justify its worth. The audience was quiet when she finished. Not cold, just full. Then the clapping began. Polite at first, then stronger. A few stood. Some just cried. And Ava? She didn't bow. She stepped away from the microphone like a woman who knew she didn't need permission to lead. Two women approached her afterward, both with tears in their eyes. One whispered, "Thank you for saying what I've never been brave enough to put into words." The other held her hand a little too long, nodding silently. It wasn't fame, it wasn't a contract, but it was connection. Real and earned. As Ava gathered her notes, someone cleared their throat behind her. She turned and found him. Graham Whitmore. He looked different. Still in a suit, yes, but no tie. And something softer in his posture. Like a man who'd finally stopped trying to prove something. "I wasn't here to judge the pitch," he said gently, "though it was excellent." "Then why are you here?" Ava asked calmly. Graham reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to her. Inside was a single photo. Ava stared. It was Hermid rehearsal. Barefoot, arms lifted, eyes closed. It wasn't posed, wasn't polished, it was alive. "You changed the way I remember her," Graham said, voice quiet. "You didn't replace Eleanor. You restored something I hadn't felt in years." Ava didn't respond right away. She looked at the photo again, then back at him. "I didn't walk away because I was angry," she said softly. "I walked away because I needed to know if the strength people saw in me was mine." Graham nodded. "I never doubted it was. I just didn't realize how much you needed to prove it to yourself." There was a pause. Not awkward, just full. Then Graham stepped back. "I'll let you be," he said. "I just wanted you to know the door you walked through. It's still open. But this time, you set the terms." He didn't wait for a response. He just nodded once and left. That night, Ava sat at her kitchen table. The apartment still rattled when the laundromat machines hit spin cycle. The heater still needed kicking. But Sophie slept soundly, curled in her bassinet. A stuffed rabbit nestled beside her cheek, the one Graham had bought on a whim months ago. It was the only gift she'd kept. Not out of pride, but because it had made Sophie laugh when nothing else could. Ava looked at the envelope again. Turned the photo over. On the back, written in Graham's neat, deliberate handwriting, "You were never anyone's reflection. You were always your own light." She closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but to picture what came next. Not a return, not a repeat, a choice, her own. The auditorium was modest. It wasn't the kind of place that hosted galas or black-tie premieres. The walls were plain. The folding chairs mismatched. There were no velvet curtains, no spotlight glow, but every seat was full. Parents, donors, artists. A few journalists, too, some curious, some skeptical. They had all shown up to see what one woman could possibly offer that hadn't already been done 100 times by bigger names and bigger programs. They came to see if Ava Carter was just a headline or something more. Backstage, Ava stood barefoot, black leotard, hair pinned back. She didn't wear satin, didn't need a title card or introduction. The music would come. But the story, she'd already lived. The lights dimmed. She stepped out onto the floor. There was no choreography in the traditional sense, no counts, no classical sequence. What followed was something raw, unapologetically personal. Ava danced like she was mapping her journey across the floor. Every pause was a memory, every turn a choice. There were moments she stumbled intentionally, moments her arms reached for something just beyond her. She didn't perform for them. She revealed. From the front row, little Sophie clapped, not at the right moments, not with any rhythm. Just because her mother was moving, and to her, that was magic. A few in the crowd smiled. Some blinked fast to hold in emotion. And when the music ended, the room didn't erupt. It paused. Stillness, breath, then applause. Not polite, earned. Some people stood. Others just cried quietly. Ava didn't bow. She walked to the microphone. When I was 19, she began, voice steady, I thought survival meant disappearing. I thought that if someone gave you a lifeline, your job was to be grateful, to be quiet, to never ask for more. She looked around the room, not seeking approval, just connection. This year, I learned that survival doesn't always look like hiding. Sometimes it looks like reclaiming your name, like walking back into a space that once saw you as a burden and saying, I belong here, not as a favor, but as a force. The room held its breath. I didn't build this program to honor anyone's legacy. I built it because no child should grow up thinking they're only worthy when they're rescued. She glanced toward Sophie. The baby giggled. Movement didn't save me by erasing my pain. It saved me by giving it shape. And if I can pass that to one person, just one, then none of it was wasted. A beat. Thank you. After the event, the crowd buzzed around her. Some wanted to ask about her process. Some just wanted to say thank you. She shook hands, accepted hugs, even laughed, but one figure stood apart near the exit. No press pass, no clipboard, just Graham Whitmore. Quiet, watching, not as a sponsor, not as a shadow, just as a man. She walked toward him, Sophie now balanced on her hip. He smiled, not wide, but real. Was it what you expected? She asked, tilting her head. Graham looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. It was better. She raised an eyebrow. And now? He hesitated. Now, he said slowly, I stopped trying to finish Elena's story. And maybe, he shrugged lightly, I start mine again. Ava didn't rush her reply. She looked him in the eye, soft, but grounded. Not if I'm just another Eleanor, she said gently. You're not, Graham said without flinching. You're the chapter she never got to write. The last time Ava boarded a plane, she had been desperate, exhausted, humiliated, holding a crying baby and nothing else. This time, she walked through the airport alone, not because she had no one, but because she no longer needed saving. Sophie was home with Clara, tucked in safe with the same stuffed rabbit Graham had given her long ago. Ava's destination wasn't a shelter. It wasn't even a dance studio. It was Boston, where she'd been invited to speak at a symposium on arts and trauma recovery. No press, no handlers. Just her. She didn't tell Graham she was leaving, not out of anger. Just clarity. But fate doesn't wait for permission. As the plane coasted toward altitude and the cabin lights dimmed, Ava felt someone sit beside her. She didn't turn at first. She didn't have to. Clara told you, she said flatly. Graham chuckled. She still thinks I'm good for you. Ava smirked, but her eyes stayed on the clouds. I came, he said softly, because I needed to say it without business. without obligation, without Elena. Say what? That I see you, not just as a story worth telling, but as a future worth walking into. She finally turned to face him. You changed my life, Graham, she said, but I'm the one who rebuilt it. Exactly, he whispered. A long silence followed, not uncomfortable, just full. And what if I don't have room for anyone else right now? Ava asked. Graham smiled gently. Then I'll wait in the row behind you like last time. Ava laughed. Not politely, but freely. The kind of laugh that sounded like hope. As the plane glided toward its final descent, Ava leaned back, eyes closed. Not because she knew exactly where she was going, but because this time she was flying forward. Back in Seattle, the weather was doing what it did, bestraining without apology. Ava Carter pushed open the door to her apartment, shaking water from her coat, one arm instinctively cradling Sophie, who had fallen asleep in her arms. The flight back from Boston had been smooth, but something inside her had shifted like a page turning. Her symposium speech hadn't gone viral. There were no viral clips or standing ovations, but afterward, a mother with burn scars on both hands came up to her and whispered, "You gave my pain somewhere to go." And that, Ava thought, was enough. Days passed quietly. She resumed teaching at the community center. Her beginner students squealed at her return. Aria, the quietest of the group, brought her a folded paper swan with the words, "Thank you for making my legs feel brave." Ava posted it above her dresser. Not a trophy, a truth. Late one afternoon, she was locking up the studio when a familiar voice called her name. She turned and saw Danielle Brooks, standing beside a new mural in progress. "I thought you'd disappear after Boston," Danielle said, arms crossed. Ava smiled. "Tempting, but I've learned how to stay now." Danielle handed her a folder. Inside, a project blueprint. The Movement Collective, a non-profit focused on trauma-informed dance for underserved youth. Hybrid programming. Community performances, on-site mental health support. It wasn't just a proposal. It was an invitation. Danielle looked her square in the eyes. "You ready to build something for real?" Ava hesitated. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. This wasn't just choreography. This was architecture for something lasting. She nodded. "I think I am." Over the next few weeks, Ava worked from her kitchen table. Sophie played beside her with stacking cups, while Ava typed grant letters, edited budgets, scribbled schedules in the margins of junk mail. She met with city officials, community partners, old dancers with tired knees and hearts still burning. Everyone wanted to help, not because of her past, but because of what they could see now. A woman becoming herself, in public, without flinching. One evening, while walking Sophie home, Ava passed the building where the Florence Initiative lived. She hadn't set foot inside since the day she left, but the lights were on. Curtains drawn. Someone rehearsing in Studio B. She paused. The door was right there. And yet, she didn't move. She didn't need to. That place had been her beginning, but it was no longer her foundation. Her roots had moved. The next morning, Ava received an email from a name she hadn't seen in months, Margaret Green. Subject, "One more student." "Ava, I've got a young dancer. 7 years old, gifted, wild. Guarded. She won't let anyone touch her arms. I think she needs someone who knows what pain feels like in a pirouette. She's not looking for grace. She's looking for permission. I figured you might be the right voice." No pressure. MG Ava didn't reply right away. She sat with it, then read it again, and smiled. Because she understood exactly what Margaret meant. She remembered that version of herself, the girl who danced like every step had to prove she belonged. Now, she was ready to be the voice that said, "You don't have to prove anything. You already do." That weekend, the Movement Collective launched its first community workshop. The studio wasn't fancy bare walls, a concrete floor, a few mismatched yoga mats, but it was full. Kids, mothers, 2 grandfathers. A woman who had lost her son last year and hadn't spoken in weeks until she stepped into the rhythm and found her breath again. Ava stood in the middle of it all, not as a performer, not even as a teacher, but as a holder of space, a protector of becoming. As the class ended and kids spilled out the doors with juice boxes and giggles, Ava leaned against the wall and exhaled. She wasn't exhausted. She was anchored. Later that night, she tucked Sophie into bed and reached for the photo Graham had once given her, the one of her dancing, eyes closed, body mid-air. She turned it over. On the back, his handwriting still whispered, "You were always your own light." For the first time, she believed it, not because he said it, but because she'd proven it to herself. Tuesday morning started like any other. Ava Carter woke up before sunrise, padding barefoot across the cold kitchen floor. She boiled water for coffee, quietly arranging Sophie's cereal, scribbling a quick note for the studio volunteers. Nothing dramatic, nothing poetic. Just life. She was no longer bracing for disaster, no longer chasing rescue. She was simply here, living, breathing, moving forward. And then the letter came. It wasn't in a manila envelope or some fancy courier slip. It was tucked neatly into her mailbox, folded into a simple white envelope with no return address. Ava turned it over in her hands twice before opening it. Inside was a single typed page. The signature at the bottom made her breath catch. Clara, assistant to Graham Whitmore. She scanned back to the top and began to read. "Ava, I hope this reaches you in peace. I'm writing not as Graham's assistant, but as someone who once watched you walk into a storm with your head held high and a newborn in your arms. You likely don't remember me, but I remember you. I've worked for Graham for nearly a decade. I've watched him build skyscrapers, dissolve contracts, give speeches on stages you can't see from the ground, but I've only ever seen him pause once. It was that night on the plane, when you were whispering into the phone, holding your daughter like the world was closing in. That moment changed him. He never told you, but I will now. The Florence Initiative was always meant to be retired after Elena. He had no plans to reopen the residency, no desire to relive the past. Until you. Not because you reminded him of her, but because for the first time in years, he saw a future worth starting, not just remembering. You didn't just walk through a door, you unlocked one that had been sealed shut. Thank you for that. I thought you should know. Clara Ava read it again and again. She didn't cry. Not this time. She just stood at her kitchen counter, letter in hand, sunlight crawling across the cracked linoleum like a slow applause. She whispered, "Of course he didn't tell me." Because Graham never did things for praise. He did them because something inside him had been broken, and maybe she had helped glue one piece back in place. That afternoon, Ava walked into the studio with a clarity she couldn't quite name. She led her class like always, counting rhythm with her palm, correcting a 6-year-old's turned-in foot, adjusting music volume with her elbow. But inside, something was quieter, like a hum that had finally stopped. She no longer needed to prove she belonged to anyone, not to the initiative. Not to the doubters, not even to Graham, because she knew now this life. She built it. Later that week, Danielle Brooks called. "We got the funding," she said, not even trying to hide the grin in her voice. "Your grant pitch worked." Ava laughed into the phone, a laugh that came from her diaphragm, that rumbled with pride, not disbelief. They had done it. The Movement Collective would go full-time classes, partnerships, mentorship programs, even a traveling performance series for youth who'd never been on a stage. Danielle asked. How does it feel? Ava leaned against the wall, Sophie asleep in the stroller beside her. She exhaled. Like we just put down roots. That night, Ava pulled out her old rehearsal journal, the one she hadn't touched since leaving the conservatory. The pages smelled like dust and beginnings. She flipped to a blank sheet and began to write. Not notes, not instructions, but choreography, something new, something for the next showcase. Something she would not perform herself, but teach. Because now she was passing the torch, not from a place of loss, but from abundance. The next day, as she stepped out of the building, she saw someone waiting near the sidewalk. Graham. Hands in his coat pockets, no suit, no umbrella. Just waiting. She didn't stop walking, but when she reached him, she paused. No more letters from Clara, she said with a raised brow. He smiled. She does what she wants. Ava tilted her head. You came for something? Graham met her eyes. Not something. Someone. A long pause. Not uncomfortable, just full. Then Ava asked, and if I'm not ready to let anyone in right now? Graham's voice was soft. Then I'll keep showing up anyway. No gifts, no offers. Just me, right here when you're ready. Ava nodded once, not yes. Not no, just a maybe, which for now was more than enough. The sun had barely risen, but the studio was already alive with energy. Little feet pitter-pattered across the floor. Nervous giggles echoed from the dressing room. Parents peeked through doorways, clutching programs printed on recycled paper. And in the center of it all stood Ava Carter. Calm, focused, exactly where she belonged. This wasn't Lincoln Center. There were no critics in the crowd, but for Ava, this showcase meant more than any standing ovation she'd ever received, because this wasn't about reclaiming her past. It was about creating something for the future. The showcase was the first performance hosted by the Movement Collective. A free event, open to all, held in a repurposed middle school auditorium with creaky seats and soft lighting. The backdrop was a painted banner made by the kids themselves, stick figures in leotards. Rainbows, words like strength and safe. Ava stood backstage with her dancers' children aged 6 to 13, each one wearing mismatched dancewear, homemade costumes, and nerves tangled in their fingertips. She knelt down in the middle of them and whispered, "This isn't about perfection. It's about presence. Go out there and show them who you are." They nodded. One girl hugged her tight. And just like that, the music began. The first piece was simple, deliberate. A group of 6 children moved in a circle, taking turns stepping into the center, striking a shape, then stepping back. Each pose told a story, some bold, some uncertain, but all brave. In the second piece, Ariatha, quiet 7-year-old, who once wouldn't lift her chin, danced a solo. She moved like she was tracing the memory of something she hadn't known she remembered. When she finished, she looked toward Ava in the wings. Ava didn't clap. She pressed a hand to her heart. Aria smiled, and that was enough. Midway through the program, Ava stood behind the curtain, arms folded, watching a duet unfold, 2 boys who had once refused to speak to each other now catching one another mid-fall with instinctual trust. She felt someone step beside her. Graham. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence had become less of a question and more of a quiet offering. Ava leaned in slightly. "You see this?" she said. "They're doing this. They're healing themselves." Graham nodded. "They had to see it was possible. You showed them that." After the final piece, a group improvisation inspired by the theme, What Safety Feels Like, the crowd stood to their feet. Not roaring, but full of something deeper than applause. Parents wiped tears. Volunteers hugged each other in disbelief. Even the janitor, who had seen the studio slowly transform over months, clapped like he was watching his own grandchild perform. Ava stepped on stage last. Not in dancewear, not to perform, just to speak. She took the mic and waited for the hush to settle. "When I first danced again," she began, "I wasn't trying to create a performance. I was trying to remember who I was." She looked across the rows of faces. Some strangers, some who had stayed, some who had doubted, and still returned. "I didn't think I had anything left to give," she said. "But the truth is, what we carry, even when it feels broken, still has value. Still has rhythm." She paused, breathing through the weight of it. "I didn't build this program to save anyone. I built it so they could save themselves." A long silence. "Then thank you for believing in that." As the audience dispersed and kids devoured post-show cookies in the hallway, Ava made her way back to the studio, heels off, hair loose, Sophie on her hip. She was answering a question from a young parent when someone tapped her shoulder. It was Margaret Green. Dressed in grey, no nonsense, still elegant. "I told Danielle you could hold a room," she said, "but I didn't know you could hold a whole generation." Ava smiled. "That makes two of us." Margaret looked down at Sophie, then back up. "You're not just dancing anymore," she said. "You're rewriting the music." That night, after Sophie was tucked in with her stuffed rabbit, Ava stood by the window of her apartment. Rain traced patterns on the glass. Her body ached, but in the best way. On the table sat a folder labeled The Movement Collective, Fall Expansion Proposal New Studios. Scholarship Program, Trauma-Informed Certification Training. She would present it next week. She was ready. Her phone buzzed. A message from Graham. "Can I bring dinner tomorrow? No speeches, just Thai food and quiet." She smiled. Typed, "Bring spring rolls, and come as you are." She hit send, then put the phone down and reached for her journal. There was still more to write, still more to build, still more to move through. The stage was different now. Not a black box theatre, not a community rec centre. This was a modest auditorium in Portland, warm wood tones, soft lights, 100 folding chairs arranged in quiet anticipation. It wasn't glamorous, but it was full. Ava Carter stood behind the podium, waiting for the crowd to settle. She wore a navy blouse and jeans, no leotard. No performance makeup. She hadn't come to dance, she'd come to speak. To tell her story, one more time, this time by choice. The event was part of a national symposium on the intersection of art and trauma recovery. When the invitation arrived months ago, Ava almost turned it down. She didn't feel like a keynote. But Danielle Brooks had called her that morning and said, "They don't need a professional, they need you." So Ava said yes, not out of pressure, but because she meant it. She looked out at the audience, therapists, dancers, social workers, educators, and right in the middle, holding a spiral notebook and sipping black coffee, Graham Whitmore. She didn't smile at him, didn't need to. He was here. "That was enough," she began. "I used to think surviving meant escaping. Getting out, getting away. From failure, from shame, from anything that reminded me I'd fallen." A few heads nodded. "I thought once you were rescued, you had to prove yourself worthy of being saved." She paused. "But healing doesn't come from running. It comes from rooting. From returning to the places you once wanted to disappear from and saying, 'I'm still here.'" She spoke about Sophie, now 2.5, with mismatched socks and opinions about breakfast cereal. She spoke about the night in the hotel room, about the note. No strings. Just rest. She spoke about the studio, the collective, the children who reminded her every day that transformation wasn't loud. It was quiet. And earned. Then she paused, took a breath. "I didn't dance tonight," she said, "because I wanted this story to end in stillness." She looked at her hands. "I've spent years building things that move. Now I want to build something that lasts." After the talk, she stepped off stage and was immediately surrounded. People wanted to ask about training programs. about trauma-informed techniques, about how she found her voice again. But Ava kept her answers simple, because this wasn't about theory, it was about presence. She didn't need to impress, she needed to connect. Later that night, she and Graham walked to a quiet cafe nearby. No reservation, no plan. They sat in a corner booth, candlelight flickering between them. Graham looked at her for a long moment. "You said it ends in stillness," he said. Ava sipped her tea. "It does," she replied. "Not silence, stillness." "There's a difference." He nodded, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small box. Not velvet. Not dramatic, just simple. He set it on the table. "I'm not asking for a future you're not ready for," he said. "I'm offering a chapter, only if you want to co-write it." Ava opened the box. Inside wasn't a ring. It was a silver pendant, shaped like a doorway. She stared at it, then looked up. "I'm not the same girl you met on that flight," she said quietly. "I know," Graham replied. "And I don't miss her, because I get to stand beside the woman she became." A long pause. Then Ava reached across the table, took the pendant, and smiled. "I'm not saying yes to the ending," she said. "I'm saying yes to the next scene." 2 weeks later, the final showcase of the season began at the Movement Collective's new flagship studio. Parents packed the space, kids warmed up by the mirrors, Sophie handed out playbills with hand-drawn stars on them. Ava stood in the wings, clipboard in hand, calm and collected. She didn't perform. But when the final bow came, the children insisted she walk out with them. So she did, not center stage, not spotlighted. Just there, barefoot, grounded. Smiling, she looked to the crowd, saw Margaret, Danielle, Clara, and in the last row, Graham holding Sophie in his lap, both of them clapping like their hands knew exactly what this moment meant. Ava took her final bow, not to mark an ending, but to honor the beginning she chose. In a world that often glorifies resilience as noise-loud wins, dramatic comebacks, Ava Carter's journey reminds us that real strength often whispers. It moves quietly, through small decisions, waking up again, trying once more, choosing dignity over pity. She didn't reclaim her life by being rescued, but by learning when to accept help without losing herself. She walked away from comfort when it came with strings and built something lasting with her own 2 hands. For those of us who've lived through seasons of loss, change, or starting over, Ava's story offers something rare: permission. Permission to begin again. To not be defined by what broke us. To create a legacy that isn't about applause, but about presence. Whether you're 30 or 70, it's never too late to become the kind of person who stops chasing approval and starts building something honest. Not perfect, but real. Because sometimes the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't a title or a trophy. It's a space where others can finally breathe, move, and believe they are enough. Just like Ava did, and still does.